and welcome to the Wellness with Juanita podcast. I'm your host, Juanita Nagai, an American living in Japan for 20 years. I've gone through some massive life changes and crises in my 20 years here. At its bleakest, I felt very isolated, alone, and helpless in the face of what was happening. I relied on alcohol and cigarettes to get through it the best I knew how, which worked until it didn't, and everything fell apart. I made it through with a little help from my friends, a fledgling mindfulness practice, and learning how to become my own strongest ally. I quit drinking and smoking, worked my way through my grief, found ways to forgive, created new connections, and started a regular exercise, meditation, and self-care routine. I've also become a national board certified health and wellness coach along the way, and developed a desire and passion to help others on their own personal journeys. This podcast is all about change, growth, healing yourself, learning how to get back up after life kicks you down, and exploring mindfulness and self-compassion as incredible tools available to each and every one of us to do just that. Hello, welcome to the Wellness with Juanita podcast. I'm your host, Juanita Nagai. And in today's episode, I am going to be talking about how to deal with difficult emotions. I have called this leaning in other places. I have a workshop of the same name, and it's one of my most popular workshops, actually. It's a very popular topic because I think as human beings, we all know how uncomfortable and difficult it can be to deal with difficult emotions. I think a lot of people are interested in learning about what they could possibly do to handle them better, or maybe they want to control themselves better, or we want to find a way to fix this kind of human problem that we encounter, that all of us encounter. So I do think that it generally tends to kind of raise a lot of interest. And if you're here, perhaps that is part of the reason why. But I just wanted to clarify at the very beginning, one, I am not a therapist. I am not trained as a therapist. That is outside the scope of my credentialing. And if you are in crisis or dealing with really overwhelming, difficult emotions right now, I do recommend that you reach out for support. If you're in Japan, there is TEL. They have a crisis hotline and a crisis chat. I will put a link to their services in the show notes. In general, finding a trusted therapist or counselor can be incredibly helpful in dealing with traumatic experiences or really difficult crisis situations that you're experiencing perhaps in the moment. So I do recommend that you try to reach out and find those resources if that is what you are needing. This podcast and today's episode is intended in a more kind of general layman's terms sense of how do we deal with difficult emotions in general as they pop up from time to time, which they do for all of us. So that was one disclaimer that I wanted to make sure to address right away up front. The other thing is this idea of leaning in. I think that I have used the term leaning in as a contrast to what our general inclination and human tendency is towards difficult emotions, which is to push away or turn away or run away, whatever direction you want to think of it, or however much resistance you want to think about it. If it's a pushing, if it's a hiding, if it's a running away. But in general, as humans, we are hardwired to avoid pain. And that includes physical pain, and it also includes emotional or mental pain. So in the same way that when we reach out to touch fire, our hands instantly and automatically pull back from that. We are hardwired and we know that that's dangerous. We know that that's going to be painful. So we take our hands away before our brains even have a chance to think about it. Our bodies just instinctually know to pull back and away from that. I think in much the same way, when it comes to emotional or mental pain, we also have learned ways to almost automatically and instinctually pull away from that, or pull back, or shut down in various ways. And I think that that is individual. We all have different kinds of coping mechanisms, or we have learned different ways to keep ourselves safe and protective from that perceived pain. But what we do all hold and share as humans is that tendency or that instinct to try and protect ourselves and to not want to go there wherever the pain is. So that is what I mean when I am using the phrase leaning in. I think there is also actually an element and a layer of leaning in and kind of digging into what is there, but it's more a recognizing and not turning away from whatever that painful, difficult emotion is. So those are the two things that I wanted to put out there right front and center. Another kind of addendum to that is that I am also not advocating for leaning in or turning towards difficult emotions or stressful experiences in your life unless you are feeling resourced, ready, and relatively comfortable and capable to do so. As with any kind of training and with any kind of practice, we want to start small. We want to stay relatively within our comfort zone. The way that growth occurs is that we push ourselves slightly outside of that comfort zone, but we don't want to do too much all at once. If you were learning to lift weights, you would start with the lowest, smallest incremental weights, right? Maybe you'd start with 1 kilogram barbells or whatever. You wouldn't start with 50K. It just wouldn't work. It'd be too difficult and you'd hurt yourself in the process. The same thing applies when we're talking about our emotional or internal muscles. What we are trying to do is to try to practice being with difficult emotions like frustration or anger or irritation or even sadness or feeling grief, things like that, in small doses and in small steps so that we can kind of build up those inner resources and those inner muscles so that when the big stuff does come, which it will, we feel that much more prepared, or maybe even just resourced, or maybe we just even have that much more experience to recognize that that is what's happening before we get overwhelmed and subsumed and carried away by whatever that big event or emotion or experience is. So saying all of that, what am I even talking about when I'm talking about difficult emotions? I just gave you some examples. I think things like anger, irritation, frustration, sadness, grief, embarrassment, guilt, even shame. These are all the more negative or difficult emotions that we tend to want to avoid. And again, for really understandable reasons, we don't want to feel pain and we want to protect ourselves. And as children, I think that we all learn different ways to do that. So it's not even necessarily that everyone has had a traumatic or a really difficult or abusive childhood, although there are certainly lots of people who have experienced that. all of us have felt hurt and felt small and felt scared as we were young and as we were forming our understandings of ourselves and the world, our relationships, and how we interact with our caregivers or our peers or other people in the world. All of these formative experiences have really shaped what we understand to be true and what we have learned to do to try and keep ourselves safe and to try and keep ourselves protected. This then manifests itself in lots of different ways as we grow and develop and get older. And the further that I go on my own journey and the more that I work in this inner world, I see how much it is connected to our outer world. So many of the undesirable behaviors or habits that we may engage in as adults, I do think are directly linked to and tied in, all wrapped in there with how we came to understand ourselves and our connection to our caregivers and our relationships with people in the world and with the world itself. It's all mixed in there. And the more that we are brave enough and willing to do this work and to start to pull apart the different threads and try to follow them down, the more that we are able to understand why we're now doing the things that we're doing that maybe we realize are not serving us anymore, if they ever were. And we can start to unravel those threads and we can start to change them and really heal from these wounds and this pain that we may be carrying around, even not realizing it. So the more that we're willing to follow these threads and the more that we're willing to engage in this inner work, I think the more it really truly heals us and can put us on the path to really understanding ourselves better and leading more meaningful, fulfilling, healthy, happy lives. There's a reason that we want to do this work. And there's a reason why turning away or pushing away or trying to avoid, numb, disassociate from the painful negative emotions doesn't really work. I don't know about you, but for me, as someone who used to drink heavily and drink a lot and drink for many, many years, those emotions need to come out somehow, somewhere. And when I was doing everything in my power to avoid them and push them down deep and just numb and distance myself from all of the terrible things that I didn't want to face or all of the things I didn't want to think about using alcohol, what would happen is that from time to time, they would literally just erupt out. And I'd find myself sitting on the floor sobbing for hours and hours because I was trying to push everything inside and hide it and wouldn't face it and wouldn't allow it to be what it needed to be. I was avoiding my grief and I was avoiding my pain and I was avoiding my anger and my rage, and I was trying to not think about it the best that I possibly could. But of course, it needs somewhere to go. It will find its way out eventually to not great effect. I mean, it doesn't feel good to be sitting on the floor and sobbing for 3 hours at a time either, right? So that's one aspect of it. Look, even if we avoid or distract or numb or push everything down, it finds a way out eventually. And it might not be in the most constructive or helpful ways. I think a lot of men in Western society are taught that, the only acceptable expression of emotion is to be angry. And usually that is in a violent way. So that's not really helpful or constructive for themselves or the people around them. So what we want to do is start to learn how to just, first of all, recognize that we all experience negative emotions and that is simply part of the human experience. That is a very natural human response to difficult and trying and stressful situations and times of our lives. We all experience them. None of us get out of here alive. We're all going to suffer loss. We're all going to experience physical illness. We're all going to lose people that we care about. Even small things, just getting frustrated with our partners or irritated with our children or even people that cut us off in traffic. We all experience this whole range of human emotions. And that's just part of what life is. So I think number one, just recognizing that it is a part of life and that it's nothing to run away from. And we can try and learn how to deal with it a little bit in more skillful ways and in healthier ways. So as I was preparing for this podcast today, I actually thought of two of the more stressful situations in my own personal life and how I was able to kind of process the negative emotions in different ways. These are things that I've talked about repeatedly on my podcast and in my newsletters and things like that. So if you know me, you are familiar with these stories. The first was the death of my mother, which was very sudden and was very unexpected. And so it was this really shocking, overwhelming blow. And because of what happened soon thereafter and my husband moving to another prefecture, I felt like I wasn't able to really process those difficult emotions or process my grief in the months and year afterwards because it was just so overwhelming and so overpowering and just so shocking. Like I just went into shut down self-preservation survival mode. And that included drinking and smoking a lot because that's just what my coping mechanism was. But also, I think because I was so needed and I needed to take care of my daughter, I needed to be some semblance of a functioning mother for her, that all of my concentration and all of my energy was kind of there. I'm not saying that I did a good job, especially in that year that my husband was gone, but we did make it through and she was well fed and clothed and well loved and all of those things that are important to me. But I think all of my time and all of my energy was spent there, like it was given to her. And so I wasn't really able to be honest with myself and to look at myself and to deal with my grief until much, much later. When I did feel like I was able to turn towards my grief and towards myself was when I had a couple of months at home on early maternity leave, and I was taking an online writing course for people that were dealing with grief. And every day I would experience an outpouring of emotion that I had kind of been running away from. And I had a supportive community. I had specific assignments every day that I did. And I was able to find a way to slowly start opening up and to allow those difficult emotions the space that they needed. And it was the beginning of turning towards my grief so that I could find a way through it. The other difficult situation that I thought of was when I was on bed rest with my second pregnancy. And again, it was this slice out of normal life because I was at home and I was alone and I was not allowed to do anything except just sit or lie on the sofa for 5 weeks. And so, in all honesty, I was not trying to deal with the difficult emotions then. I was trying to stay positive and I was trying to keep my hands busy and I was trying to, again, take care of myself the best way that I knew how. But when it became apparent that there was no hope for the pregnancy, in that time, both at home and in the hospital, because I was admitted for 2 weeks, I was able to process and allow all of my grief and all of my sadness and all of my frustration and all of my cursing the universe, all of those difficult negative emotions were able to be expressed. And I think I felt safe enough to allow them to come out because I didn't have to take care of my family. I didn't have to go to work. I didn't have to be a normal functioning member of society. I just had to lay in a bed and feel all the feels. And I'm not going to lie to you, it was really, really hard. It's not like I did that and then it was okay and everything was better. It was really, really awful and it was really, really hard. But I think being honest about how awful and how wretched and how difficult it was and being able to express that in real time helped me to process and grieve much easier, much faster than I did with my mom. Because with my mom, I had to kind of hold it together and keep it together for my daughter for so long that I, ended up bottling it up and trying to run away from it with booze. And then it just came out in all of these unexpected, sudden ways throughout that year and a half. And like I said, it wasn't until I was able to really have some time outside of normal life that I was able to kind of turn towards it. I think what I'm trying to highlight by sharing those heavy stories is to say that with my mom, I tried my best to shove it really down deep, hold it all in, just ignore it and numb it away. And that did not work for me. And it was that much more difficult to try and sort through and deal with much later. And with my complicated, difficult pregnancy, I was able to kind of do all of those things in real time. And so it was easier to kind of process and deal with. However, what I really wanted to talk about today is not when it is such a dark, deep, huge can of worms. I really think that when it's something like that, finding a therapist or finding a support group or confiding in a really wonderful, amazing best friend like I did is what we need to do. We don't want to make it harder on ourselves by trying to go through these things alone. What I wanted to touch upon today, though, is not those really hard things, but how do we deal with difficult emotions when they come up in our lives on a daily basis or just in general? So how do we start to practice for when we have those really hard, difficult times? And there's this wonderful technique that is not something that I came up with on my own. It's been taught for many years in the mindfulness world. I think Tara Brach has popularized it the most. She is not the original creator of it, but I learned it from her. And she is, again, very widely known for this. So I'm going to use her version. But it is a technique called RAIN, and that is an acronym. And it stands for recognize, allow or accept, investigate, and the final N is nurture, the way that Tara teaches it now. But I think that this little mnemonic device and just remembering that one word rain can really help us start to practice how to just be with difficult emotions when they pop up and not push them away. So I'm also going to offer this as the takeaway from today's podcast episode, and I will go through it with you. If you are interested in being guided through it, you can go to Tara Brach's website or just Google rain. And I'm sure you will find so many YouTube videos and things like that that can help guide you through the process. But I will just talk us through it using a basic example. Okay. The idea of using this technique and using rain is that one, it just makes us feel a little bit better because we don't get subsumed and overwhelmed by the negative emotion. And two, I think that it creates just that much more space around the emotion or the experience, whatever it is that triggers the negative emotion. It just creates that much more space around it so that you can try to respond a little bit better, perhaps a little bit more skillfully, instead of just reacting, which is what a lot of us do when we are sad or angry or frustrated or irritated, all of these kind of hot, intense emotions. We tend to have some knee-jerk reaction. Another anecdote that I did want to share before I get into the specifics of rain was something that I noticed while I was on retreat. Being with my own thoughts in all of that stillness, deep into the retreat, I did notice that when more painful or difficult thoughts, just the thoughts themselves, would flip through my head, because again, that's what our minds do. The thoughts come unbidden. I would flinch. I would shift in my seat, or I would take a deeper breath, or some kind of reaction, like my body itself was pushing away from painful thoughts and painful memories. And it was an interesting observation, and it really sent home the message of how deeply it is ingrained for us to want to push away from painful things at this almost like a cellular level. Painful memory flits through the mind, and we instantly move or shift or try and trick ourselves into pushing it away and not having to look at it, not having to think about it. So how can we try to, even if it's not necessarily lean in, how can we just be with these negative emotions in a little bit more spacious sense? So let's turn to rain. The first step of rain is to recognize. I think this is the biggest, most important step in a lot of ways. If you can recognize that you are getting angry or frustrated or irritated, more than half the battle is already won. Just by naming that emotion, we say that we name it to tame it. If we're able to say, oh my God, that is so frustrating that guy just cut me off. It was my turn to go while we're driving down the street. Just by naming it, we already are giving ourselves a little bit of space. We're already saying, I'm irritated and I'm frustrated, or even I'm angry. We're giving ourselves the opportunity to then allow it or accept it. Just, this is how I'm feeling. And that doesn't mean accepting it by rolling over and saying, well, this is what always happens to me. It doesn't mean that we're a helpless victim and there's nothing that we can do. That's not what acceptance means. What it means more is just, that is what is happening. I am angry. I am just allowing and accepting that that is my reality right now. I'm not pushing away from it. I'm not picking up my phone to start scrolling and distract myself right away, or, whatever it is. We're just allowing that that is what's happening. The I stands for investigate. And this, I always advise clients to keep in mind: kindness and curiosity. We want to keep the investigation not in this, why do I feel this way, or what's wrong with me, negative way. We want to just honestly check in with our bodies, check in with ourselves, and try and see where we can feel it. So if it is anger, if it's the person cuts you off in traffic example, what does that feel like in your body? Do you have a clenched stomach? Do you feel tightness in your shoulders? Do you have a vein throbbing in your forehead? Like, where can you feel that emotion physically in your body? And again, by focusing your attention on your physical body, it's taking you away from your angry mind and the angry thoughts and the story that you might start making instantaneously. It's putting you back into your body. It's grounding you into what's happening in the moment. And say you notice that and you're like, okay, yeah, I feel really tight. You're also then able to say, well, hey, can I release that if you want? But even just noticing it, again, it's creating a little bit of space. And then the final N, as Tara Brach teaches it, is to nurture. So then ask yourself, what do I need? Do I want to try and release that tension with a couple of deep breaths? Do I want to make myself feel better by swearing at the car and releasing the frustration and the anger in that way? Do I want to just pause and make sure that I don't rush out into traffic in an angry fashion and potentially cause an accident? It just gives you a little bit of literal breathing room. And all of that, the more you practice it, it can happen in 10 seconds. It's not like this is like a long, drawn out process. The more that you start practicing this, the more you start to recognize these emotions as they come up, and the more space that you create for yourself in all of these different situations. And again, if we start small, and we start with little things like being irritated at people in traffic, or recognizing when our children get us frustrated because they're not listening to what we're saying for the 100th millionth time, we can recognize that rising within our middle section as, now I'm feeling frustrated. And instead of yelling or having an outburst, we can recognize the feeling, and it gives us a little bit of pause to think about, now, how do I want to deal with this? Do I need to raise my voice? Maybe sometimes that is what is necessary, but it gives you a choice. Do I want to do this, or do I want to maybe try to get down at their level and maybe get my face in front of their face and make eye contact so they really hear me? But the more that we can practice this, the more we're able to recognize what is actually happening. And the more that we are able to choose our response, and the more that we're able to then start thinking about how it might or might not be connected to the other behaviors and habits and coping mechanisms that we do throughout our life. Maybe we recognize that when we are stressed out and work is busy, or after we get off the phone with a difficult family member and we head to the freezer and we pull out the tub of ice cream, we start to recognize, I'm really frustrated by this difficult conversation that I just had, or grading papers during final exams is taking so much of my energy. I'm feeling really sleep deprived and tired and overwhelmed with work. If we can start to recognize and allow that that is our reality, and investigate how it's making us feel physically in our body, and then check in with what we need, what we can do to nourish or nurture ourselves, the more we're able to do that in bigger and bigger and wider circles. Maybe just by recognizing what's happening, we're able to make a different choice. Rather than pulling out the tub of ice cream, we decide to go for a walk around the block. If any of this is interesting or new for you and you'd like to learn or talk more about it, I am always more than happy to talk about this. You can reach out to me in the DMs on my Facebook and my Instagram pages. Those links are in the show notes. You can also send me an email at info@wellnesswithjuanita.com. I'd love to hear what you thought about today's podcast. I will add all of the links to Tell. I'll put in a link to Tara Brock's meditations on rain as well, and have my contact information links in the show notes as well. Until next time, thank you so much for tuning in, and take care.